Right, good morning everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate the time you've taken to join our webinar. And we're really excited to discuss this important topic with you. My name is Sophie Hill. I work with Chris Kirk at CJK. So we're recording the webinar, just to let you know, and we'll share the recording afterwards. Just ask if you could go on mute. We can mute you as well, but if you just click in there's a microphone button in your top bottom left. If you go on mute,
okay, it's on mute. I thought when I opened up, I thought it wouldn't be on mute.
Okay, thank you. We will make time for questions throughout. So in the bottom of your screen, there's a chat box. You can click on that, type your questions in. We'll collate the questions together and address those at an appropriate time during the webinar. But we really do want to hear from you. It's really important that we understand your views as well. So please make use of the chat function with questions and thoughts. Joining us today, who are speakers for today, we've got Chris Kirk, who's the founder and director of CJK and former CEO of GEMS Education, and two of our associates, John Murphy, education leadership mentor, former CEO of Oasis, and John's actually been head teacher 7 times of all different phases of education, and also Mandy Coalter, who's the founder of Talent Architects and former director of people at United Learning. So thanks to them for joining us this morning. Just one more thing before we crack on. Chris, if you go to the next slide, just to introduce CJK, if you've not met us before, we're a consultancy company specializing in trust strategy, operating model design, benchmarking. So what that means is that we help trusts to operate more efficiently. We've been working with hundreds of trusts for over 7 years, benchmarking cost and quality of trust operations, helping trusts to shape the size and structure of their shared services. We're a platinum partner of CST, and we run masterclasses in operating model design and setting up and developing shared services. I'm now going to pass you over to Chris to start the webinar.
Morning, everybody. Great to see you all here. There's kind of a game of 2 halves in this meeting. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about some fresh evidence of what's going on with mergers, and we're going to invite you to discuss a little bit and contribute to that view. And then we're going to move on to how can mergers be more successful, and again we'll be inviting you to contribute to that as well, and we'll be sharing our sort of war stories from the front line with all the different work that we've been involved in. As I'm doing this first part, then, what's going on with mergers, probably going to talk for 5 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes. Please do be thinking about the following questions. How is MAC growth trending in your region? Are you still seeing growth? Are you seeing diminution? Are mergers accelerating where you are? We're going to share some benefits and risks that primarily school leaders and some trust leaders have identified about mergers. I'd love your reactions to those. So it'd be really great to get your contribution to that as we go through. But to begin at the beginning, why is it people merge? Well, people merge ultimately to create trusts that tap into the trust dividends that all successful trusts have tapped into. I was part of the research on building trusts about 7 years ago now, and revisited that at Confederation of School Trusts. And so these are all the different reasons that both sort of trust and school leaders come up with for the trust dividend they feel that they can access. And the purpose of a merger is to allow these to continue, or to allow them to be enhanced. And they can be educational, they can be about enrichment, they can be about talent, they can be about sharing services and getting more efficiency, and always the need to preserve local autonomy and difference, which I fiercely believe is not at odds with also sharing services or collaborating over curriculum. But the challenge for trusts has always been that they're very fast-growing organisations in a very fast-growing industry. And we know from many other industries that that's really tough. And you start with these sort of small, young organisations growing through, evolving through this phase of creativity. But that sort of way of working soon hits the buffers when there are too many schools to do that, usually about 3 or 4, and you start to hit your first crisis. And you need to go through a bit of a revolution of the role of the centre, how you're set up, in order to move into the next phase, which often involves putting in a lot more direction, a lot more standards, a lot more systems, central processes. But what often happens is those are layered on top of what is still predominantly got a lot of school level operations, particularly if that's in the kind of operational areas like finance, IT, HR, and estates. And essentially this becomes extremely expensive, and a trust often hits its next crisis, which is one of efficiency, which is manifested by heads saying we're paying too much top slice and the centre saying we don't have anywhere near enough cash. And you know at that point you're hitting your next crisis and have to go through another revolution. This is often where trusts start to set up shared services, and rather than have a centre that's imposing rules on schools and schools complying with them, you move towards the centre providing actual services, providing finance, HR, IT, and sometimes estate services, and the schools, then become really important customers of those services. They need to have a very strong voice in what they're receiving. That's all really difficult and often not got right at first. And the next crisis is often one of effectiveness, manifested in things like, the head teacher saying, I used to hunker down with my school business manager at 5 p.m. if I hadn't got my recruitment advert sorted out, but now I have to fill in a form. I wait 3 days, then they come back with a query from central HR and I've lost the window to recruit that candidate. And so the way that the services work together with heads and the way that everyone adjusts to that new way of working is the next real kind of revolution. Hopefully then you move into the sunny uplands of collaboration, where you've got that direction, you've got the systems and processes, but also the services are really responsive and you're working together in a collaborative way. But then what comes along is the next phase, which is moving into mergers or acquisitions. And that, of course, upsets all the apple carts. You've been through all of that change. Suddenly you've got to go through a load more change. And the chances are, of course, the two trusts who are merging, or the one that's being acquired in, may be at very different stages in this journey. And that produces a lot of its own challenges as well. So that's something about the kind of intrinsic nature of the trust challenges, and particularly how those are amplified at the point of merger. I want to just hand to John briefly, though, to talk about sort of what meanwhile is happening in the real world that you're all facing.
Morning, everyone, and again, echo the welcomes to this webinar. We're thinking about responding to the challenges in the system, and mergers being one response. But I think it's really important we all remind ourselves the why we're here. And right now, as I go across a whole range of mats across the country, there are considerable challenges that I know that you're meeting and trying to face. And I think one of the questions that we're drawing from today is merger one of the big responses to this challenge? And if so, why? So when we're thinking about the disadvantage gap, EPI just a few weeks ago recorded that there's now a 19-month difference in learning gains. We know about all of the conversations that are happening in the SEND sector. I think we're all cognizant of the fact that the post-COVID, it laid bare some of the inequities in society, and actually the impact of COVID still draws on. And I think that was very much referenced by the CST reception the other day when Laura was talking about that. But also the really big impact across the sector in terms of the stark decrease in the number of children coming through primaries, and actually the impact that's going to have on the sector over the next few years, together with sustainability. And sometimes when we're growing, we have to make sure, and we'll cover this later in the webinar, about are we fit for purpose as we're merging or as we're taking on acquisitions, and do we know that other organisation well enough in this process? But back to you, Chris.
Thanks, John. So despite what's sort of been a definite change in direction from the new government, with obviously withdrawal of TCAF funding and a bill going through that appears to kind of create quite a lot more regulation and a bit less freedom for trusts, I suppose I just wanted to give you an update on the data, and the good news, it hasn't yet had a massive impact on the desire for academisation. You can see there the 2025 figure there, which is just around 600. It's a little under the 800 that we had in 2024, but it's well up on 2023, well up on 2021. So although we're not at the sort of levels that we were in the 2010s to 2020s, and probably will never go back to them short of a big change in policy, you look at this and you say there hasn't really been a sea change in appetite. Will this feed through later? We don't know. But to the next point that's relevant to that question, what about the pipeline? This was the pipeline at the same time in 2024, and this is the pipeline in 2025. So it's down on 2024, but again, it's up on 2023 and 2022. So taking a snapshot as of now, what's in the pipeline for academisation, again, there doesn't appear yet to have been a big impact on demand. Now, of course, these academy applications take some time, so there may be a bit of lag there, but we should continue to expect, I think, academisation at similar levels. And then rolling that forward into what does that mean for academies of different sizes? We're continuing to see the decline of SATs. This shows the last 3 years. You can see the number of SATs diminishing at a rate of 300 or 400 a year. The number of trusts that have got 2 schools is diminishing. The number of trusts with 3 to 5 schools is really diminishing quite sharply now. And instead, what we're seeing is a growth in 6 to 10, a particular growth at 11 to 20. And then interestingly here, if we look over the last 3 years, in the most recent year, the number of trusts of 31 to 40 has really increased. And a lot of that has to be to do with mergers, because it's very hard to get to that kind of number organically. So what does that mean for the future of academies? At CJK, we create this model which takes the data and rolls it forwards as a forecast from 2025, where we are now, out for the next 5 or 6 years. So based on the trends that are in the system at the moment, this is what we expect. We think that there won't be any SATs. I mean, there may be 1 or 2, but at a sort of overall level, more or less no SATs by 2030, no trusts that are just 2 schools, and actually by then, almost none that are 3 to 5. So 6 will be the size of trust we're used to, and particularly trusts of 11 to 20. And so that again is what sort of the sector is driving towards, and it's natural that people are looking to mergers to achieve that, because if you're a trust of 1, 2, 3 at the moment, achieving that sort of size organically is probably going to be very, very difficult. And that's why either mergers or acquisitions are driven forwards. And we'll have a system with startlingly fewer trusts by that point, down to about 1,000, we reckon, from the sort of 2,000 or so that we've got at the moment. Does that seem unlikely? Maybe, but in 2020, you know, if we think back, we had, you know, much closer to 3,000, including SATs. So, you know, we think that is very possible. So what is that meaning in terms of people's perceptions of mergers? Well, first of all, what's happening in the system at the moment? This was pretty interesting. We found that 10% of people that we asked in a recent survey are in the process of a merger. This is a sample of about 150 school leaders and trust leaders, so it's fairly robust. About 10% are in the process of a merger. Last year, the same number was about 5%, so it's doubled, and probably accelerating. 12% have explored one, but it didn't go ahead, so that's kind of the same again. And a third of people have been through a merger. So if we add all of those together, the majority of academies in our system right now have had some interaction with a merger, and only 43% have had none. We have to kind of think and acknowledge for a moment, colleagues, the impact that's having on everybody in terms of hope, fear, energy and time to do that. And, you know, please do sort of in the chat, you know, write your own thoughts on these topics as we go through. Then I just wanted to talk about the perceptions of mergers, and John and Mandy will pick up on this later. When we asked people, what was the dynamic of your merger? Did another trust merge into yours? Did you merge into another trust? Did you both merge on a relatively equal footing? logically, the number who said a trust merged into my trust should be roughly equal to the number who said that they merged into another trust. Except, of course, for larger trusts that are acquiring a lot of smaller trusts. And so you can see that many more people are sort of on the receiving end of a merger, which, you know, really is an acquisition when described like that, than are on the side of taking them on. So we need to think a lot about preparing people for this side as well. What is it like to be merging into another trust, as much as what is it we need to get right when we're doing the taking over? And a relatively small number, which I think probably resonates with us all, would describe it as a merger on a relatively equal footing, you know, only about a quarter. Why are people doing it? We asked about what's driving this, what was the reason for it. Finance and economy was the predominant reason, either very important or important. Capacity and growth were next. Down here, I suppose for me, at a slightly disappointing fifth in the list was improving outcomes. Maybe those are an indirect result of the merger. I was surprised perhaps that it wasn't more linked to personal things like a CEO retiring, and often not seen to have been directed by the regional director, but actually something that the groups themselves decided they wanted to do, which means probably they will continue, because we're not looking so much to government to drive this. Is that what you'd like to see? Should improving outcomes be higher up the list? We'll kind of do some provocation on that later, but I'd love you to be putting your thoughts in on that as we go through. If I think about the benefits of mergers, so whereas the first slide was those who've actually been involved in mergers, what was the drivers for that particular merger? This is a more general question we raised about what people see as the benefits. But again, overall, it's the sort of financial side that's at the start. Some great things about capacity and expertise. But again, you know, I have to say I'm a little maybe surprised and kind of understandable why people are driven like this. But I guess ideally, you would think that the whole purpose of this would be that we can know that this is going to improve outcomes for pupils. Perhaps would have been interesting to see that much higher up the list. Love your thoughts on why that might not be the case and whether it should be. What are the risks of this? Many people signalled it's about a loss of trust, a loss of school identity, a loss of local voice. Now, I mean, the predominant voice here is academy leaders rather than trust leaders. So that's interesting. That's what academy leaders fear. A culture clash as a risk, and key personnel might leave. And again, I'm sorry to bang on about it. You know, we put the suggestion it could be a distraction from achieving outcomes, and that was very rarely selected. And yet in practice, I would say in the mergers that I've seen, that is a real risk, particularly where it's a merger of two significantly sized organisations, as opposed to maybe an acquisition of a very small trust by a very large one, where I would, you know, agree that that's less of a risk. So those are some thoughts on the trends that are happening, and those are some of the evidence coming back from the surveys as well as from the hard data. So let's move to our first discussion. And what I'd love to understand is how is MAC growth trending in your region? Are you seeing mergers accelerating, and why? And what do you think about those benefits and risks that were identified by school leaders with some trust leader voice in there as well? We'll start with some of the questions that are in the chat, and please do be putting your own thoughts in. I'm just going to give you 30 seconds just to reflect on what we've said. There's been quite a lot to take in, and jot your questions in, and then I'm going to pick up on what's in the chat, and then probably we'll invite people to speak as well. So I'm going to pick up on the first question. Hi, Andrew. How are you doing? Just down the road from me. So Andrew, do you want to come off mute and just sort of put your question in and sort of what's driving that question?
Oh yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, no. As you know, I mean, we're involved. We're currently in discussions about integration, let's say, of two successful mats. So it's an interesting situation because they both bring very big strengths to coming together. One of the issues we've got, and clearly it's about addressing all of those risks and uncertainties and the angst that goes around for leaders and people in both mats in these situations is around timescales, because you don't want these things to be protracted. And yet one of the things we're coming up against, and it's early days, but it's almost, well, yeah, but we need to get DfE approval, and that takes time, and you've got to get this paper in that's quite involved. And I get that, the whole business case, the whole thing around that, but it's going to take quite a long time for them to get it signed off. I don't know. I'm just anxious about whether you get any sense of whether the DfE are or the Department of Education are recognizing this and putting resource into supporting some of these mergers. Because if they take long, you just get that protracted period of uncertainty that doesn't seem great for anybody, really.
Yeah, great question. John, what's your sense in the mergers that you're involved in as to how much support DfE are lending? We do have a stat on that later on, actually, but what's your kind of anecdotal feeling on that?
So I think what they're doing is the conversation that's happened at DfE is one of consolidation and making sure that there's a much more intelligent design of trust across the piece. However, sadly, Andrew, I don't think that they are adding any additional capacity to that. They're driving that through the normal advisory boards, and they don't have capacity to lend any additional capacity to support in the process. They see very much as this is a trust endeavour and will continue to be a trust endeavour up until the business case is obviously then presented back into the advisory board.
Yeah, thanks, John. So turning to Karis's question, yeah, I mean, what people are telling us is when they don't go ahead, sometimes it's a concern over staffing once you actually get to the nitty-gritty and people realise that there may not be a fit for senior leadership in one half or the other. I mean, this obviously is in a dynamic where kind of both halves still have a say in it, and I guess that's natural. Also a shame if it's that sort of interest of adults, that if there was a view that it would improve outcomes for students, but it's obviously understandable that staff interests would be key. Often it's trustees that the chief execs may get together, but it's the trustees who are worried about the perhaps the values or the direction of the trust that they'd be moving into. Occasionally it's the regional director who will intervene there. And sometimes I think it's just that the process overwhelms the desire to do it. People run out of capacity and run out of time, and have too many other priorities to do it. But I'd be really interested in others' perspectives on that. I'd be interested then to pick up on your point, Helen. You said you are seeing it rising in your area.
Our region generally was quite slow, I think, in terms of picking up on academisation. But I think we do see now that there are opportunities, and certainly some of the schools are really taking that on board. But because we work in, I would say, a very collaborative way generally across schools, this is going to take quite some time to actually get to the point at which we're, I think, ready to move into mergers. We take our time. Yeah.
Great, thank you, and thanks, Susan and Lucia and the intriguingly named PC for your comments in the chat there. Very, very interesting. And I want to press us on, if that's okay now, to the next section where we'll talk about the practical implications of all of this. So how can we make mergers more successful? And the questions I'd like you to have in your mind as we discuss this is, first of all, what do you think leads to a successful merger? We'll share some thoughts. how have you found bringing staff and communities on the journey with that? And what sorts of advice and support are you getting, and which ones in particular, I suppose, are lacking? What do you feel you need more of to be more successful? So I'm going to hand over to John.
Thank you, Chris. So I think one of the most important things that we are all discovering as we go into this next phase in terms of the MAT world is actually being clear about what makes a merger and what makes an acquisition, and using that language not interchangeably, but being really precise and thinking about the principles that underpin the reason for the merger. So a lot of trusts that I'm working with have talked about merger, but they're using that phrase when really it means acquisition. And so what we're really talking about in a merger is the fact that you are co-creating a brand new organization with a brand new vision, values, and mission. And that's the sense of one of the most important conversations right at the heart of that, about why you're doing it for the young people, and making sure that in the process of that communication, that literally every single stakeholder at every level understands it is going to be a new organization, or is it going to be an acquisition? And people don't like to use that language. Merger language is more acceptable, but actually merging is creating one brand new organization out of the two former organizations. So effectively, you're coming together as greater by the sum of the parts. Let's just go to the next slide though, please, Chris. So sometimes what happens is people want to do things, but I think it's important in the education world that we go back to the why. So we're all here to serve our children, we're here to serve our families, we're here to serve our communities. And I think that in the conversations around this, we've just heard that one of the major reasons is about financial sustainability. And that's a practical fact. But let's remember in this process, the why of what we're doing. So what I'm going to ask in a moment for you all to pause and actually think then for yourselves, in this process of merger, what is most important to you as a leader in the system or as a trustee in the system? When I've been working with trusts who are thinking of merger and I've gone through the process, it's really thinking about, well, if we've got two organizations coming together in the true form of a merger, then how can we provide a better entitlement for our students, staff, and communities? How can the two organizations, just going back one slide, thanks, Chris, how can we be in a situation then from a leadership perspective where we're creating better capacity by the organizations coming together? Thirdly, how can we be in a place where we are financially sustainable? Of course, so therefore the due diligence that happens prior to that merger is absolutely key, because just growing to a bigger organization does not mean that you're more efficient. And then finally, thinking about all the different professional pathways that a larger organization allows. Now, everyone talks in the education world currently about the recruitment crisis, and we know that 50% of ECTs, for example, leave after 3 years, but really it's a retention crisis. So what we've really got to think about is the benefits that merger brings around professional pathways of adults. So whether these are right for you, let's just now go to the next slide and just have that sense of pause. In your own mind, interrogate those principles. Perhaps in the chat on the right-hand side, just think about, are there other principles that are more important to you from what you've heard? Because this is about setting out the stall for, if we're leaders of one organization on multiple sites, everyone's got to understand it, but also believe it's the right thing going forward. If you want to add any other principles you think are more important, then it'd be really great for you to be able to do that, please. Thanks, Karis, for that. So Karis has said about the mergers to strengthen place-based leadership, etc., and capacity. So there's that sense of geography being so important. Okay, let's move on to the next slide then. So when we're thinking about merger and we're thinking about that sense of due diligence and picking up on what a colleague said about how long these things take, what I want to do is just prompt a few thoughts. So if you've got two organisations coming together, there's a sense of due diligence that's important, but also that sense of relational trust. We're going to hear later about, well, why does some of the mergers break down? And that cultural alignment and knowing each other and not having surprises along the way. So if we were thinking about some of these areas, perhaps posing some of the questions. So if we're thinking about educational provision, what's the profile of attainment and progress, not just now, but over time for each trust? And actually what's driven the mechanism behind that? So in each one of the trusts, how do school improvement strategies operate? And how can those be then shared at the earliest opportunity? If we're thinking about educational provision in the light of what Chris has said, what are the projections for the local authority admissions and impact on sustainability and admissions numbers? We're thinking as well about some of the big sticky issues to do with SEND. So in each trust, what's the quality of the SEND provision and where is best practice and how can that be shared going forward? We think about some of the financial issues. Well, different organisations operate different top slice models. How does that offer work? What's going to be the reserve strategy in each trust? And actually, when we're really thinking about it, are the schools all sustainable? And if not, are there going to be any mitigations in a timely fashion before the trusts merge? Further and future financial considerations will be if the merger goes ahead, well, what services will the brand new trust want to offer to its academies? And at that point of transfer, what contracts are under threat? If we think about the human side of this, are there equal pay claims outstanding in each organisation? What are the pension contributions being made by each trust as it joins? There are so many practical questions to ask as we go through. I've actually been working with two organisations where I was asked to come in because when the two trusts were thinking about merging, they'd made an agreement to merge, but there'd been no buildings condition survey shared between the trusts. And that bill has come to 5 million as a shock to both trusts. They're the sorts of things we derailing if we're not asking the right questions. So it's that sense of professional curiosity at every stage of the merger. If we're thinking about information technology, how does each trust manage cybersecurity if cybersecurity is one of the biggest issues that trusts are currently facing? And also, I think we have to remember that we're in the digital age now. We're not in the digital age in the future. We're in digital age now in schools. So what's the device strategy for each trust? And have further commitments been made down the line? The questions go on and on and on, but they're absolutely key to building the relational trust between the shadow boards to make sure that they understand precisely what they're getting into. To the next slide then, Chris, please. Over to you, Mandy.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Chris. And nice to see everybody here today. We're coming to this fairly new as a sector, aren't we? Mergers, acquisitions, significant growth. But of course, there are lots of sectors that have experienced this that we can learn from. And actually, I think I've been perhaps lucky, is lucky the right word, right from the very beginning of my career in all sorts of sectors. Been involved in mergers, acquisitions, considerable change, growth, and seen a lot as a result. As we've talked about, the benefits can be huge and really significant. And for us, absolutely, they are all about children and young people. But clearly, being able to do what we do much more efficiently is going to benefit those children. But I think, as Chris talked about earlier, those risks around culture clash and losing key personnel that many people identified in the survey are very real. But I would also echo what Chris said. From what I've seen in my experience, actually one of the huge risks is that distraction from day-to-day current improvement for children and young people, because mergers, acquisitions, significant growth take huge capacity and energy. And we need to make sure that we've thought about that, we've planned for that, we've got that capacity in our system, because as leaders, you still need to make sure that your trust continues to do all the things it's already doing well, on top of suddenly leading a really enormous change. So for me, that's a big issue to be thinking about from my experience. We can look to the business world from some insights on this. And it was Harvard Business Review that did a really big analysis of the success of mergers. And actually they said effectively, the truth is most merger failures aren't about the legalities, they're about people. The single biggest cause of failed mergers is people and culture issues. So if we think about all those benefits we want to achieve, actually people are not just a HR stream, they are integral to everything. How we deal with our people and that cultural integration is absolutely fundamental to achieving the financial efficiencies, to achieving the outcomes for children, whatever it is we're trying to do. Similarly, research from McKinsey showed that organisations that invest seriously in cultural integration through a merger process are 2.5 times more likely to outperform their deal expectations. And who doesn't want to be there? Who doesn't want to outperform their expectations for children, young people, the savings we can make, the school improvement offer we can improve? So actually really having a strong focus on integration of people and culture matters. Now, we've talked a lot about, is it a merger, is it an acquisition? And you can use different language because, of course, the word acquisition isn't a very comfortable word. So sometimes we often slip to the merger word, but there is something early on about identifying, is this a marriage of two, a coming together and we're starting a whole fresh organisation, as John said, or is it actually the case of one trust is coming into the other, we're keeping our name, our vision, our values, probably our CEO. And those are different, but those conversations need to be had really early on because the people implications of those two are actually quite different. They both have implications, but they're actually quite different. So that alignment at the top and those honest conversations are very, very important. But then, of course, we do need to think about that. If it is a merger, what is it the trust going to be called? How do we set the values and the vision? How do we involve everybody in that and make sure it's a really inclusive process? Who is going to be the CEO? Often a thorny issue. And we've seen some articles coming out about that already, but also the top team dynamics are really important to settle early, but need some careful management because you may be inheriting two people covering the same role. And similarly, of course, you'll be thinking about bringing together your central services. And Chris talked earlier about actually making some early decisions on that can really bring about those financial efficiencies. But we have to be honest that that's people and jobs. And so when we're thinking about inclusive communication, we need to segment that because your classroom teachers probably are not impacted very early on in terms of their day-to-day job, but they will want to know why this is happening, how it might increase their professional development. They'll be subject to TUPE potentially, but some of your staff in your support functions, central functions, will be very nervous because they will know that there's a need to look at financial efficiency and that might mean restructuring a job role. So that segmentation of communication and engagement is vital, and really taking that pulse check with people throughout that whole process, that you are managing that change with care and sensitivity and well, very important. And one of the things that concerns me at the moment is part of what I do through Talent Architects is really help trusts I guess put a rocket boost up the capacity and capability of the HR function in our sector, which is about 20 years behind many other sectors. I can tell you from my own experience as a HR director, HR person involved in mergers and acquisitions, it takes so much HR capacity. It's huge. And normally I would advise that dealing with the HR function early on in that merger is important. So you've got that capacity. It worries me that we are still developing HR professionally in our sector, and then you're layering on top, a very significant change process. So thinking about that early on, have we genuinely got the capacity, not just to do TUPE and look at those legal risks and all the rest of it, and to change, maybe the pay date or whatever it is, but actually to really help drive that cultural integration support that we're going to need to do. Big question, I think, as you're approaching that merger planning. Thank you. Chris, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry, Sophie muted me to avoid the sound of my typing. Thanks, Mandy. So 2 super quick points from me before we take the questions you've been putting. Please do keep those coming in. We'll take a couple of minutes on those. First of all, we asked people, what advice and support do you get and what are you lacking? I mean, interestingly, kind of the formal due diligence, legal, sort of even the kind of government formal stance on it, people weren't so worried about. Right down at the other end on the right-hand side, not enough financial support. Hard for any of us on this call to do too much about that, but it is noted. Interestingly, if I take the next sort of 3 or 4 up though, sort of operating model design, people, culture, integration, exactly what Mandy was just describing, project management, capacity and expertise, that's what people are lacking. And not surprisingly, because it's tough enough being a trust going through a merger puts extra strain on those. How are people to know where those resources are? I mean, John, myself, Mandy and Sophie, do offer those types of support, but how do people know where to locate those, I think is an interesting challenge. Secondly, I'm not going to talk through this framework, but the key point here is the lessons I've learned, I think most profoundly have been from working with trusts who are on their second merger, because they get the chance to try and do everything right that they wish they'd done first time. And they tend to follow a format that's much more like this. So in this kind of middle section, where as soon as the merger is a sort of a thing, they start to think about our capacity to manage it. Do we have enough internal HR capacity? Do we need support with change and project management? Getting the project team set up to manage it, because people are consumed with business as usual. Again, often when people merge the first time, there's a temptation to leave those difficult conversations about the top tier and the functional design, merge and hope to sort it out later. It doesn't get any easier. It actually gets harder. So thinking up front before the merger about what the redesigned organization will look like and sort of taking that pain and having honest conversations earlier on can be very beneficial. Preparing the plans for communication, staff engagement, preparing the plans for TUPE, again, early on in the process. And then when it comes to putting it in place, thinking right from sort of, what's our performance measures, what is it educationally is now our offer, what is our operational offer in terms of service catalogues, all of that, it's a great chance to revisit it or completely revitalize it. How are we going to organize ourselves? What are our sort of systems? Are we going to align them? I mean, we must. How are we going to be governed? Those are the kind of basics of getting the project right. But to Mandy's point, this change management journey, if people aren't thinking first and foremost, do we have a compelling narrative about how this improves outcomes for our students? It's going to be really hard to take staff with you. So I think those going through successive mergers think a lot more about that and creating that compelling narrative. But obviously then quickly moving to what does this mean for me and my colleagues and making sure people have got the support. So thank you for your questions. For those who can stay on, I'm aware we're at 1:45, but for those who can stay on, let's just get some of your further thoughts. Yeah, I'd be interested to pick up on your point about the FE merger and sort of financial savings, because I think those can be overstated. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Hi. Sorry, yeah, it's Becky here. Yeah.
Hi, Becky. Good to see
you. Thanks. Yeah, went through that process back in 2009, and I think the organisations went into it quite naive, thinking that the merger was going to solve all of the financial problems of the two organisations. But actually there were many, invisible, unseen, unthought through costs. So, particularly staff harmonisation was a massive one. And what you tend to get is if you are comparing support staff roles in one trust versus another trust, what you tend to get the situation is when those two come together, you then get the equal pay claims across the two trusts, and inevitably it always tends to the higher of the two. What you then get is a more expensive staffing base than the two individual organisations. So that really does need thinking through really quite carefully.
Yeah, thanks Becky. I think that's very wise advice. Andrew, I know exactly where you're coming from, and I suspect the model you describe is quite familiar, where there is one name and you know who the CEO is going to be, but you know both trusts feel they need to bring something. I think there's something about empathy for the trust doing the acquiring, to think if I was in the shoes of the other trust, what would I want to hear? And there's a dynamic here, I think, where the trust doing the acquiring wants to tell its staff and communities, nothing's really changing, it's just our family's getting a bit bigger. Whereas for the trust on the other side of it, everything's changing and they want to hear that this is a major change and a new partnership. And I wonder, Andrew, or anybody else, if you've sort of sensed that dynamic and what practical things we might do to handle that in a better way.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, you know, my point on this really is around, and I come from the sort of commercial world, I suppose. I'm not an educationist, I'm a chair, but I'm from a business background. And you know, people go through this whole sort of, is it a merger, is it an acquisition, as if there's only kind of two things. And what I worry about, and I don't want to get into the sort of circumstances of our situation that you're a bit familiar with, but I suppose you know, for me that stuff comes from the sort of commercial world. That's about ownership and share price and which company is taking control of another company. You know, there's going to be in a MAT world. You know, clearly when you put two organisations together legally, you're only going to end up with one MAT. You'll only end up with one CEO and so forth. But you know, they're clearly, depending on the circumstances, what I would hate people to be worried about mergers in the sense that I've either got to be an acquirer or I'm going to be taken over. You know, if you tackle it, and I think all the points that you've addressed in this webinar are, you know, about getting the culture right, getting the people right, getting the real kind of common understanding and doing all your due diligence about how things are done around here and getting common ground on that. You know, if you do that correctly, and it takes an awful lot of time and effort, I'm hoping, well, I'm sensing, but in my experience, you can bring together the strengths of both organizations. You know, it doesn't have to be so kind of binary, one or the other, like I'm going to lose everything or I'm going to be the, you know, the top dog. You know, it's that. Clearly in terms of leadership, there'll be some winners and losers, but in other ways you can get the strengths right, or I sense that. I don't know what your experience is.
Well, what I'd love to do is hand to John, I think, for any sort of last words of wisdom from your huge years of experience, and on Andrew's point and just other takeouts you've had from this session, John.
I think Andrew, what you've said is absolutely spot on, and I think it's making sure that all staff feel that they belong to the new organisation.
Yeah.
Secondly, that they have real agency in the process at the right time. Where some mergers have gone wrong is where the trusts at trustee level are involving too many people too early, and it gets very complicated in those conversations. But I think the word agency is absolutely fundamental in how the new organisation might be co-constructed from the greater sum of its parts. So how you're involving people and how you're building relational trust, but building relational trust right at the right time. And so the comms plan and the project map underpinning these are absolutely key, because actually what you don't want for anyone to feel is powerless in the process. And so I absolutely agree, whether it's merger, whether it's acquisition, it's the how of what you're doing, but the how then comes back to the why. And I think for all of us as educationalists on this call, we care about children, we want the very best for them. So at the heart of our decision making, if we're thinking about them first and we're serving them first, then I think the rest follows if people are treated well in the process and we build that relational trust in the right way. But I think that comes from trust and trustees and CEOs working together, then involving your C-suite team at the right time, and then making sure that there's proper face-to-face communication across the piece. So neither organisation is seen as faceless, but we're in one new entity, and we're excited to work together for the better of the children.
I absolutely agree, John. And I think the key word there is communication. What I worry about in MATs is, you know, this is about the people, and the risk and the uncertainty for people is very unnerving. And, you know, in big organizations, you have professional comms teams that get involved and deal and help manage all of this. You know, what I find difficult, and clearly in the MAT world, it's difficult, but sometimes you haven't got that expertise, and that's where things will get dropped out. You know, the balls get dropped sometimes, and people get uncertainty. So I think the more effort can people put into getting strong communication around what's happening, it's better for everybody.
Couldn't
Brilliant.
agree more, Andrew. Couldn't agree more. Really, really vital. Absolutely critical. And it's something that we support trusts with on that piece, because it so matters. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. I'm just conscious of time, and thank you so much for coming, for your contributions, and thanks to John and Mandy and Chris as well for putting this webinar together and doing the research. Just to let you know, we've been working closely with CST to create a masterclass for trust leaders who are going through or leading mergers. That's starting in September. You can book on the CST website, and CST will also run a sister program for chairs and trustees. I know if there's been a number of people coming to this webinar who are either trustees such as Andrew or in the governance professional community as well. So we recognise that's really important when going through a merger. So thank you everyone for coming. I will send out a link to the recording afterwards. And you know, if you want to talk about what sort of support CJK, John, Mandy, Chris can help with your own merger or considering merger, then please get in touch with us. We're very friendly. Always happy to have a chat, and thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.